All right, this is the last screencast on our week 4 authors. I've jokingly referred to them as the Dead Poet Society because they all died at very young ages and they all had very scandalous lives this week. I don't know how I managed to pair them all together. I was telling somebody earlier that I feel like that woman that tells those stories and while she's doing her makeup, like I feel like with every screencast that I've done this week, it's been like this crazy story, and so this is no exception. I'm talking about Percy Bysshe Shelley today, who was married to Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, but he also was a great writer in his own right. Very prominent poet, one of the most highly regarded and influential poets of the 19th century and the Romantic period. A little brief bio on his life. He was born in 1792 in Sussex. He was born to a member of Parliament. His name was Timothy Shelley. The oldest of 7 children. He left home at age 10 to study at Sion House Academy, and which was just a little west, about 10 miles outside of London. After 2 years there at Sion House, he enrolled at Eton. While he was there, he was severely bullied both physically and mentally by his classmates, and so he began to kind of retreat inside of himself, into his imagination, and he was prolifically writing during that time. He published 2 novels and 2 volumes of poetry during that time period. In 1810, he entered University College in Oxford. While it was a better academic environment for him than Eton, he got himself into a little bit of trouble. He had this pal, his name was Thomas Jefferson Hogg, and they together wrote a pamphlet about the necessity of atheism, and it called into question about whether or not God existed. And so the university found out about it. They were angry about it, obviously. They called both boys into the office and demanded that they either acknowledge that they wrote it or deny that they wrote it, and Shelley refused to do both, and he was kicked out of school. So this makes his parents really mad, because they had enough of his radical beliefs, which included vegetarianism, his political radicalism, and his stance on sexual freedom. And so they were like, hey, you're going to give all this up. You're going to come into the straight and narrow. And he's like, no, I'm good. So in 1811, he runs away with a woman named Harriet Westbrook. And let me tell you a little story about her. So she was a 16-year-old girl who was very much the antithesis of what Shelley's parents wanted for him. They did not want them to be together. He was expressly forbidden actually to see her. But Westbrook was a little bit of a drama llama. She was always threatening to kill herself, and she had a lot of emotional highs and lows. And as a result, Shelley thought if he married her, he could keep her from committing suicide, which is a great way to start a marriage. And so he does. They run off together. But he really quickly finds out after they elope that this is not a situation that works for him. She was needy. She was very emotional. And so he sought solace in other women. Maintaining his marriage, though, they did not divorce until much later. So he starts seeing this teacher, this school teacher. Her name was Elizabeth Hitchener. And it's widely speculated that she is the muse for his first major poem, which was Queen Mab, which, little side note for you, Queen Mab first appeared in Shakespeare, was described in Romeo and Juliet. Mercutio talks about Queen Mab in Act 2 of Romeo and Juliet, Act 1, the end of Act 1 of Romeo and Juliet. That's neither here nor there. I really don't know why I chased that rabbit. Okay, so in addition to the long form poetry that he had written in the beginning, I love this. Shelley also began writing political pamphlets And he had such an imaginative way to get these out to the public. So he would distribute them from hot air balloons. He would put them in little glass bottles and send them in the water, and they would float ashore at places and people would find them. And he would also put them in paper boats, which this story would be so much better if those were like little love poems or like romantic stories. But no, they were political tracts. But whatever, you know. In 1812, he meets William Godwin, who was a very outspoken, radical political philosopher. William Godwin was married to Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a social activist in her own right. She was very much leading the charge for the rights of women. She penned a vindication of the rights of women, all the suffragette things that were happening at the time. And they had a daughter named Mary that Shelley found himself very interested in. Now, you have to remember that he's still married to Harriet. Their relationship is still very troubled. They do end up having 2 children together. Their first daughter was born in 1813. Shelley was 21 years old. Her name was Elizabeth. And then before their second child was born, Shelley ups and runs away with Mary, the daughter of Wollstonecraft and Godwin, who was his mentor. And Godwin was against this 100%, probably because Shelley was married with children. Didn't want his daughter running away with this cad that's like up and leaving his wife and kids. But he refuses to acknowledge this relationship, refuses to speak to Mary and Shelley for almost 3 years. They are separated from their family. So they fled to Paris. Okay. They take Mary's sister Jane with them. They visited France, Switzerland, Germany, Holland. They're just taking it on the road. They love to read aloud to each other from Shakespeare and another poet of the time or before Rousseau. When they finally returned home, Mary is pregnant. He has gotten his lover knocked up. And his wife, who was pregnant when he left with their second child, is very close to giving birth. And we already know she has a very big history of being mentally troubled. And this finding that his lover was pregnant kind of sets her over the edge. So she requests a divorce. She sues Shelley for alimony and for full custody of the children. Their second child, his second child with Harriet, Charles, is born in 1814. And then 3 months later, Mary, his lover, gives birth to their daughter, who dies just a few weeks after birth. 1816, Mary gives birth to second child, William. Dedicated vegetarian, R. Shelley. He authored several works on diet and spiritual practice regarding vegetarianism. In 1815, he writes one of his largest major work, which was Alastor, The Spirit of Solitude. Okay, so in 1816, Shelley gets invited to go with Mary's stepsister and Mary on a trip to Switzerland. Claire Claremont was her stepsister's name, and she was dating the romantic poet Lord Byron, who we've already talked about in this section. And they kind of rented a house and they ran around together like for this whole summer. This is oddly enough where Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. So there was like this competition one night at dinner, who can write the scariest ghost story, and Mary Shelley pens Frankenstein during this trip. And Shelley himself is writing a lot. Percy is writing a lot during this time period. He wrote Hymn to Intellectual Beauty. He wrote Mont Blanc because he was really inspired by his trip there. So 1816, they return home, return to England. Mary's half-sister had died, had committed suicide. And then in that same year, they find out that Harriet had also committed suicide. She had thrown herself into the Serpentine River in Hyde Park in London, very public place there. And so they found themselves caught up in a custody battle over the 2 children that Shelley had with Harriet. And the judge decided that these kids would be better off with foster parents than they would with the dad who had abandoned them and abandoned their mother. So go figure there. But in a lighter note, Mary's family was happy that they had returned and had decided to welcome them back to the fold, and he was able to patch up his relationship with William Godwin. Okay, so they moved to Marlow, and it was there that Shelley began running in the same circle as John Keats, who is also another poet from our week this week, and Leigh Hunt. Both of them were very talented writers in their own rights, and Shelley's conversations with them and their little literary circle that they had formed really started changing and helping him develop his own literary pursuits. 1817, Shelley leaves for London. Lord Byron was living in Venice, and Claire Claremont again has decided that she wants to take their daughter, hers and Byron's daughter, to see him, to visit with him. So Shelley and Mary tag along, and then they start this kind of like tour of Italy while they're there. While they're in Venice, their baby daughter Clara dies, and a year later, their son William also passed away. So a lot of loss in Shelley's life here. About this time, Shelley wrote Prometheus Unbound. So I told you that Mary Shelley had penned Frankenstein. It was originally under the title of A Modern Prometheus, and so Shelley Percy writes the play Prometheus Unbound. In kind of a response to Frankenstein. Okay, so on July the 8th of 1822, Shelley drowned. He was sailing in a schooner, which is slightly smaller than a yacht. And he had traveled to meet Leigh Hunt, who was a writer that I mentioned earlier. He had to discuss a journal that they had penned together. It was called The Liberal. And so while he was traveling back home, we're still in Italy. So when he was traveling back to where they were staying at the time, the boat capsized and Shelley drowned, and his body washed up on the beach in Veragio. And so a lot of people at the time thought that it was an accident, but kind of conflicting evidence kind of shows that it may have been planned. It may have been a murder by someone who despised Shelley's political beliefs, because he was very outspoken in his political beliefs. Mary has Percy's ashes burned on the beach where he washed ashore, and then later he was interred in a cemetery in Rome. And then over 100 years later, his ashes were dug up from there, and he was memorialized in Poets' Corner, which you can visit in Westminster Abbey in London. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Ozymandias. This is one of my favorite poems that comes out of this time period. And we're going to we'll read and then we'll start our discussion of Ozymandias. So I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. So this was originally published in 1818 in the Examiner in London under Shelley's pen name Gilrastus. And it's a sonnet. Shelley's speaker is kind of encouraging or encounters a traveler from an antique land, someone who has been wandering, and this traveler is going to tell this story of this wreckage that he found while he was in the desert, the wreckage of a great pharaoh's statue they are in the desert. And so that is kind of the setup there. It's thought to be a Petrarchian sonnet, which is an Italian style sonnet, even though the rhyme scheme varies a little slightly from that traditional sonnet form. Structurally, all sonnets contain 14 lines. They're written in iambic pentameter. The rhyme scheme, again, is slightly off. It's A, B, A, B, A, C, D, C, E, D, E, F, E, F. So differs from the Petrarchian sonnet, which the first in the octave, and I'm out of